Hey and welcome gurus to this demo lesson, Implement Application Gateway. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company, and it's in this demo lesson that we're going to use a case study scenario to learn about implementing Application Gateway. And then we're going to talk about the demonstration steps so that we understand the steps we'll go through to finish out the demo build out to get the intended Application Gateway solution. And then we'll bring it back to the slides for some key takeaways. Now to get started for our case study scenario, our Control-Alt-Suites organization in the Azure Cloud Sandbox, when we do the demo setup, is going to have a hub virtual network. And this is going to have two subnets that consist of resources, one with a virtual machine and another with an app service. And this is so that we have options for different types of compute to be able to balance between for our application gateway solution. Now, again, as always, the setup resource is available in the resources of this lesson so that you can set up your Azure Cloud Sandbox to follow along with the demonstration. The very first step that we'll go through as part of this demo is implementing our Azure Application Gateway by configuring the Azure Application Gateway with a purpose-built subnet using the suggested and recommended CIDR for Microsoft. And in our case, we'll select that once we get into the configuration details. We're also going to make sure it's inside the same region as the VNet and the resources it contains so that it can be associated with that virtual network. And then we're going to configure the various components of our application gateway. When we deploy it, we'll configure the front end IP configuration, the back end target configuration, and we'll configure the routing rules so that we can tie in the listener, the back end, and the HTTP settings to route traffic to our back end targets. And once we've done all that, we'll review the configuration for this to make sure that we have implemented everything, to check that our application gateway serves our traffic to our backend target, and then we'll discuss some thoughts for making these solutions production ready. So without further ado, let's make our way to the Azure Cloud Sandbox and get started. All right, gurus, here we are in the Azure Cloud Sandbox with the Cloud Shell configured so that we can get started. If you haven't done so, make sure to configure your Cloud Shell instance using a storage account by clicking here and following the setup. Now, once you've got that open, make sure to grab the resources from this lesson for the demo setup. And once you have that open, we can grab all of this here by copying it and then pasting it into our Cloud Shell. This is going to pull down that file and it's going to start a deployment for creating our demo setup here. We're going to have to provide our username, so pick a username for yourself. And then we're going to have to provide a password. Provide your password. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and hit enter for artifacts location SAS token without typing anything. That's just so that if we had a SAS token we wanted to provide, we could provide that there. We don't have one in this case, so we'll hit enter and we'll just let it run off and create our deployment of our resources so we can get started with our application gateway demo. So we'll be back once this is done provisioning in about 15 to 20 minutes. All right, gurus, so we're back and our deployment has succeeded. So if we minimize the Cloud Shell here, what we'll see is our resources. If we go ahead and take away the essentials blade right there by minimizing it and sort by type, we'll see we have an app service here. We have our virtual machine. We have our virtual network. We go into that virtual network and look at the subnets here. We see we have a hub subnet 1 where our VM exists, and then we have an app service subnet where our web application app service exists. Now quickly, we'll go to the overview here. We're going to take a look at the location for our virtual network because we'll need to make sure that the application gateway is inside the same region. So it's West US in my case. Make sure to validate which it is in your case so you can select the appropriate option. And then we'll come back into our resource group here. We'll go to our web app service real fast just to take a look to see that it has a URL and it's using HTTPS. So it's a secure URL that if we click on, takes us to our web app that's running and waiting for us here. So we'll exit out of that, and on our virtual machine, we don't actually have a public IP, so we won't be able to check that unless we had configured it for a backend with a public solution like Azure Load Balancer or Azure Application Gateway. At this point, we're going to implement our Azure Application Gateway, so we'll come up to the search bar here, we'll type in load balancing, and we'll select load balancing, help me choose here under services, and we'll click create on our application gateway. Now we'll configure it here for our resource group. We'll give it a name. We'll call it the ACG Demo App Gateway 01. We'll choose our region here, in my case West US, so make sure to choose the correct region for your virtual network. And here's where we can configure our tier. Again, we talked about having basically V1 versus V2 tiers, and you see that here where we have the V1 standard and then the V1 WAF and then the V2 for standard and V2 for WAF. So it really comes down to, do you want a web application firewall, and do you want to have the V2 features or the V1 features? If you want V2, that'll give you things like enabling auto scaling. So we're going to choose WAF V2 here, and we see we have that feature for enable auto scaling. But if we chose standard, well, we don't have that availability. So we'll go with the WAF V2, and we see we have enable auto scaling, and we can specify the minimum instance count here. Maybe it's 1. And then for our maximum instance count, maybe we'll want to use 3 in this case. And so we can specify this to determine how we want to auto scale our solution. Then we have the firewall status, and we can choose to disable or enable this. If it is enabled, we have the modes that we can choose between, which are detection, which means basically alert us if something happens, but don't necessarily prevent that traffic. And then prevention is going to alert us, and it's also going to prevent that traffic. So we're going to leave this as disabled, and then we see we have the availability zone. Now for this particular region, we don't have support for availability zones yet, but if we did, we would be able to choose one or more availability zones. So as you're deploying this, you may be able to do it depending on which region your virtual network got deployed into, because it's based off of the resource group when that template goes and runs and deploys the resources. In my case, I don't have that support there, so I'm going to leave it at none. And next we can choose to enable HTTP 2. By default, it is disabled and it uses HTTP 1.1. So we'll go ahead and choose to enable this. And then we're going to choose our virtual network. Then we're going to choose our subnet here. And we don't have a subnet, so we'll have to create one here. We'll click Manage Subnet Configuration. And we're going to click Add Subnet here. We're going to call this our App Gateway Subnet. And because we chose a V2, we're going to use that /24. If we were using V1, we could use a /26 because those are the recommended per SKU for Application Gateway. We'll click Save here. It's going to add that subnet to our virtual network. And as soon as it's done, we're going to exit out of it here, and it'll bring us back into the configuration details where we'll select our new subnet, App Gateway Subnet, and we'll click Next into Front Ends here. And now this is where we can choose between public, private, or both. And in this case, we're going to use both here. And because we chose V2, you're going to notice that we have to specify the private IP address because it only supports an allocation method of static, not dynamic. So we'll create our new public IP here, and we'll call it the ACG Demo App Gateway 01 PIP. And we see it's going to be standard and static. We'll click OK. And then for our private IP address, we'll select yes to provide it with one. We'll give it 10.60.3.4 because it has to fit into the subnet where we're deploying that application gateway. And then we'll click Next into Backends. Then here's where we can add our backend pool. We'll click Add a Backend Pool, and we'll call this our App BE Pool. And here we can choose to add a backend pool without targets if we want to add them later, or we can choose to add them now, and we can add between IP address or FQDN, virtual machine scale sets, and app services. And we can have a combination back in here. If you see here, we select our app service, and then we go and choose virtual machine, and we select our virtual machine. You'll see that it says adding a virtual machine, VM scale set, IP address, or FQDN to a backend pool that's containing an app service is possible by using PowerShell, but not by using the Azure portal. So we can do this with PowerShell, but not here in the Azure portal. And as you can see, also there's a typo here in the error message. But we'll go ahead and delete this virtual machine from the backend pool here. And we're going to click Add to add that app service to the backend pool. And we'll click Next for configuration. Now we have our front end here, and we have our backend pool here. So what we need to do is create a routing rule to connect these two. So we'll click routing rule here because that's what ties everything together. We're going to call this our default routing rule. And then we're going to specify a priority. Again, we can specify priorities between 1 and 20,000. 1 represents the highest priority, with 20,000 being the lowest. We'll go with 1 here. And then we'll come down to creating our listener. Again, this routing rule ties in the listener, and it ties in the HTTP settings and the backend targets. So we'll name our listener here. We'll call this our listener 1, and then we'll specify the front end IP here. We can choose to use the public or the private. In our case, we're going to use the public here, and we can specify the protocol that we want to use in the front end. This is where we can specify that TLS termination. We can use HTTP if we want it to be unencrypted, or HTTPS if we want to be encrypted. And we'd have to upload a certificate here. And we can also upload a certificate from Key Vault. Again, this is because we're using V2, we have that Key Vault integration. We're not going to do that in the front end here because we do not have a certificate to upload. So we're going to use HTTP in this case. And then we can specify the port here. We could specify 443 if we were using that HTTPS. But in our case with HTTP, we're going to use port 80 here. So we'll leave it like that. And then additionally, we see we can specify our listener type. We can choose basic, and basic is going to be if we wanted to set it up to just have one web application. So essentially hosting a single site behind this application gateway. We could use multi-site if we wanted to host more than one. And we could choose to specify a wildcard to have all the different host names we want to specify here. But in our case, we're just using the one. So we'll select basic. And here we also see we can specify whether or not we want to have error page URLs that we want to provide it. We're going to click no in our case. And then next we're going to move into the backend targets here. Now for the backend target type, we can specify a backend pool. We can use our backend pool, app BE pool, or we could specify a redirection here. And we can specify the redirection type of permanent, temporary, found, or see other here. And whenever we specify a redirection, we can choose to redirect it to a listener or an external site. And we could specify that external site or that other listener here. In this case, we're going to use a backend pool. So we'll click the backend pool and add our app BE pool here. And then we can also add our backend settings. Now we don't have any backend settings, so we're going to create those here. We're going to click add new. We're going to call these our HTTP settings. Now here we're going to specify a backend protocol of HTTPS. The reason we're going to do this is because we have HTTPS for that app service using a Microsoft provided certificate. So in this case here, we could provide a certificate to this, but since we're using a well-known CA certificate, we'll click yes, and we don't have to provide it here because it is Microsoft managed. Now we have to do this because if we chose HTTP, because it is an HTTPS URL for that app service, we would get a gateway error. So make sure you configure it like this. And if you get that gateway error, that's the problem. Now the next thing we have is our additional settings. We can specify cookie-based affinity. Because we're using V2, we can specify the use of cookies for that session affinity here for our users. But we're not going to do that here. And then next we see we have connection draining. Now the connection draining here, if we chose to enable it, we can specify the drain timeout in seconds that we want to use whenever we deprovision instances for things like taking them down for service updates, so that we can make sure that we're going to stop accepting requests and slowly move those users over to healthy instances that are up so that we don't disrupt their connection and their sessions. We're going to leave this as disabled here. And then we're going to see that we could choose to override the backend path. If we wanted to override the backend path from the default path of / to / images, we could do that here. We also can choose our host name here. We can override with a new host name if we wanted to send it to a different host name entirely, but we're not going to do that here. And then we'll click no, and it will just use the default host name. But if we did here, let's say for example, let's actually choose to use a host name here. We're going to pick the host name from the backend target here. We'll let it pick from the backend target so it knows what host names are there. It'll pick, and then we're going to click yes for create custom probes. We'll click add here, and then we'll come down to see our final settings are that path-based routing, where if we had multiple routes, we could set up path-based routing here. If we click add, we'll see that we can route to different paths here, such as /foo or /bar, and we can also do the redirection or send it to different backend pools and create different backend settings and add those different backend targets. Now, we're not going to do that here. We'll click cancel, we'll click add, and this is going to create those routing rules. We'll click next into tags, we'll click review and create, and once it passes validation, we're going to click create, and it will go off and create our resource here. So once we get past validation here, make sure to click create, and it'll go off and create our application gateway, and we'll be back as soon as that is done. All right, gurus, we're back and our deployment has finished. Now at this point, because we're close on time, we're going to split this lesson into two parts. And in the second part of this lesson, we're going to pick back up from right here, and we're going to move into actually validating whether or not the application gateway works as intended for us. So I'll see you in the next lesson in part 2, where we validate all of that.